Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this session. This is week 4 of Sunoikisis's Digital Classics for Spring 2019. This week, the subject of discussion is going to be linking and annotating secondary materials, and we're going to use a case study of the Wood Diaries from the Institute of Classical Studies and Hellenic and Roman Library, and in particular a few pages related to Palmyra and as part of the expedition from 1751 that is described in there. This session is going to be jointly run by myself, Gabriel Bodard from the Institute of Classical Studies, and by Jen Baird from Birkbeck University. And Jen, I think, will start for the first few minutes giving a bit of background on the archives and on archives of these sorts of expeditions in general, and then we'll talk a little bit about what it means to annotate these sorts of things and give you some hands-on demonstration of that, so that you can then all join in as part of this grand experiment of what a mass annotation of an archive looks like. So I'll hand over to Jen now.
Hi, hopefully you can all hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, great. All right, just I'm going to share the presentation. So, this one. All right, can you see that okay?
No, we're seeing you again. Come back to the camera.
Okay, sorry. Try again. How about now?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Thanks so much, Gabby. So I thought I'd just start by talking a tiny bit about the site and then a bit about Wood and the background to the archive that we're looking at today. So as an archaeological site, Tadmor, Palmyra has a long history of study, and it's mentioned in ancient texts, but it left a lot fewer traces than in the classical canon than other major cities of antiquity. And as a result, its modern Western reception has been really largely filtered through and framed by the discovery of the site, like quote unquote discovery of the site by early travelers. And that's where we're starting today. I say Tadmor Palmyra in the first instance quite deliberately. So Tadmor is the ancient Aramaic Palmyrene name for the site, and also the modern Arabic name for the site, the current name for the site. And Palmyra in antiquity was a kind of publicly, epigraphically bilingual city. It was Tadmor Palmyra in antiquity. And so it's one of the few sites that actually deserves a double name, even though we tend to call it Palmyra. So calling it Palmyra in itself is an issue, prioritizing classical over other forms of heritage. And that's one of the things that I wanted to pick up on today, and that I think that we can use the archive to problematize a bit. So many aspects of the way the site of how it's been excavated and represented and interpreted in scholarship and for tourists can be traced back to the 18th century. So the story of claims on the ancient past and on Tadmor or Palmyra could begin in a lot of places, but for today's purposes, it begins in 1749. When the British antiquarian Robert Wood set out with James Dawkins, a wealthy heir to Jamaican sugar plantations, and another man called John Bouverie, who was also a prosperous young Oxford scholar, but one who didn't survive the trip. Dawkins, Wood, and the ill-fated Bouverie were joined on the way by the Italian draftsman Giovanni Battista Bora. They traveled the Mediterranean and the Near East, and the voyage that they made became the basis for the earliest modern account of Palmyra as a ruined archaeological site. And that's Wood's 1753 publication, The Ruins of Palmyra. This painting that you're looking at now was commissioned in 1758 by Dawkins's brother, Henry Dawkins, after his brother's death just a few years later. And the reason I'm starting with this painting is, for me, it sums up a lot of the issues surrounding Wood's engagement with the site and the way that Wood's encounter with the site framed so many later studies of Palmyra. the painting of kind of Wood and Dawkins discovering the site is, as you can tell, a very fanciful enactment of the moment that Robert Wood and James Dawkins came to the place, so kind of peeking through the palms and pointing their way to the ruins. Hamilton as a painter had been an obvious choice for this commission, so he was someone who generally selected themes from the classical past. And the two men who were the focus of this painting, Wood and Dawkins, wear classical drapery. They have profiles that are themselves torn from classical imagery, but they wear kind of quote-unquote Arab boots for a dash of exoticism alongside the camels. In the painting, which is something that circulated widely as a print as well, the way that Dawkins and Woods are themselves portrayed as classical men and heirs to classical culture is evident, and it's in marked contrast to the presentation of the Arabs who are guiding them on horseback, who are quite literally in the shadows. The two toe-gate men we see here are presented as heroes, as explorers and dilettantes, in a painted manner in which we might expect monarchs or generals. The Wood and Dawkins had been preceded, Wood and Dawkins had been preceded to the site by other Englishmen, or indeed by an entire settlement of local people, hardly mattered. What's important here is the narrative of discovery, and that sense of discovery prevails in the history that we tend to tell of Palmyra. Beside Wood and Dawkins in this painting, with his face barely visible and wearing a turban, is a figure who must be meant to be Bora, the Italian draftsman, and he's sketching. You can just you can just see the paper that he's drawing on. Holding the reins of one of the horses is a young black man whose presence in the painting we might attribute to Dawkins's slave ownership, the figure alluding to the family's Jamaican plantation-based wealth. And for me, this painting conjures a number of archaeological tropes that persist to the present today. So these include things like the narratives of discovery, the inheritance of a classical legacy by the West. And for these narratives to be successful, or for a discovery to occur, it's necessary to first presume that certain people and certain pasts don't matter, or to actively erase those pasts. This painting gives no hint that there's a contemporary population at the site, for example. So in order to discover Palmyra, as many archaeological sites needs to happen to many archaeological sites in order to discover them, the living population has to be swept away. Wood and Dawkins's notebooks and the sketchbooks of Bora, as well as some other personal material, were held by Wood's family until the 1920s, when they were donated to the Hellenic Society. So the material we're dealing with now in the Wood collection at the ICS is a personal and a family archive, which has been within an institutional collection for almost a century now. There's a lot we don't know about it, especially in the ways it was shaped before it was donated. And there are large gaps in it as well. And I'll talk a bit more about those gaps when we come to discuss specific documents. As we can see from Hamilton's painting, the story of Palmyra isn't only one of discovering new archaeological sites, it's also a story of putting claims on the past of the Middle East and reinventing it as European heritage. One of the reasons this story of this archival material is so interesting is because we can see the process by which this happens. We can see a bit of what's left out of official accounts. And in archives like Wood's, we have the possibility, I think, and I hope, and maybe we can play a bit with this today, is the possibility of writing new types of histories and making those more accessible to a broader audience. Of course, much of what has been undertaken at Palmyra between Wood's expedition and the present day, so we've got a lot of excavation data, a lot of destruction of varying types, as I'm sure you're all aware. So we know quite a bit about the site, and that's from these archaeological expeditions that started at the time of the French Mandate and have continued until recently from a huge range of nations. So we've got Polish, Italian, Japanese, Austrian, many different expeditions. And this is kind of summary map by Ross Burns of some of the archaeological excavations that have happened. This intensive amount of archaeology that's happened since the time of Wood has really been only possible because Tadmor, as it was known to local people, was swept clean of the occupation so that it could be reinvented as this archaeological site. And that's the archaeological site we now know remains presented as almost entirely classical was a construction of the kind of French Mandate era in terms of the archaeological site we see now. So these images that you see now are aerial photographs of the Temple of Bel and the village that was at the time in the 1920s still present inside the temple walls, the Temenos walls, and from 1929 through 1930, the deliberate destruction of that village and their removal of its people and their resettlement elsewhere by the mandatory government. So we have not only the erasure of later material, so the late antique, Islamic, and Christian material at the site, but the kind of quite deliberate erasure of local inhabitations. Partly as a result of those foreign expeditions, but also as a result of the long history of quote unquote collecting objects from the site, which arguably started with wood as well. Palmyrene material culture can now be found pretty much globally. Notable among these objects are the type you see here, so these very characteristic sculpted funerary reliefs. These departed the site in a whole range of different ways. So some of them went as partage, so when collections were split between Syrian and foreign expeditions, but others found their way onto the antiquities market, some kind of quote unquote legally, many not legally under any past or current framework. And you'll see examples here. So there's, in London and Copenhagen and New York, you can go to any major museum and find Palmyrene diaspora. Which is also just to say that a lot of Syrian heritage, including that of Palmyra, can be found outside of Syria. Many of the foreign expeditions publish in their own languages, but not in Arabic. And the net result is that a lot of Syrian heritage is inaccessible to many Syrians. And those are kind of some of the main issues that I'm grappling with, both in the Wood Archive and at other archives. For me, one of the fundamental questions is about responsibility. Responsibility to the material, sure, and to the past, but also to local communities. Thinking about how we might use archives as sites for new types of engagement, I think is something that's really interesting, and the possibilities for the kind of digital engagements that Gabby is going to talk about, I think are really clear and interesting. So those are the main points that I wanted to chat about. Hopefully you all caught that. I don't, sorry. All right.
Great, yes, thanks a lot, Jen. So yeah, great, thanks. So we'll come back to specifically to Palmyra and the wood materials in a minute. What we want to do in this session now is to invite both any students following this course and anyone else who may be watching this who may be interested to take part in a sort of ongoing experiment that we've been doing with some of the wood materials and with the Recogito annotation tool that you were introduced to last week. Rather than following a specific schema for annotation, to look at ways in which we might want to annotate some page images of these notebooks and other related materials, just to see what information individual people bring to this and different kinds of audiences that we might talk about, including, as Jen says, the audience who very often be left out of this, of Syrians. But for the moment, we're talking about us experimenting with this. So in preparation for that, because what we're talking about here is a form of crowdsourcing, I want to talk a little bit about different forms of crowdsourcing and what they mean and what the implications are of using this sort of methodology for collecting information, and also because we're thinking about, as I said, this is not following necessarily the Recogito schema of simply annotating a place name and saying, well, this place name can be found in Pleiades or in GeoNames, and you can disambiguate it with this URI. We're talking about other kinds of information that one might annotate in these, and we'll see later that the kinds of things you might annotate are endless, and some of the things people annotated last time we did this experiment last summer surprised us, by just being things completely different from what we had imagined anyone might be interested in. So if we're going to annotate usefully, is some element of disambiguation going to be useful? And if so, what does that mean? And so I'll talk a little bit also about use of authority lists, both in internal and external, and structured and unstructured, a little bit here. So let me just quickly share my screen to share the slides again. First, a little bit of background on crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing per se normally refers to an activity which may be commercial or not, but it's related to commercial outsourcing of labor. The classic crowdsourcing is the sort of thing that Amazon Mechanical Turk offer, where you can effectively outsource microtasks to a vast crowd, as it were, of people who may be completely untrained in your business or in your method, but who can just do human labor in a individually small scale, collectively potentially very large scale. The Mechanical Turk type of crowdsourcing is paid, although presumably not very well paid. The other kind of crowdsourcing that is very similar in the kinds of things that they ask people to do, but is not paid, and it tends to be voluntary, and can include academic projects, is the sort of thing that Galaxy Zoo may be the most famous example. This is a project whereby the researchers put up millions and millions of images of individual, very, very distant galaxies, photographed or otherwise captured by radio telescopes or similar. Far too many for professional astronomers to have looked at every single photograph and classified them. However, certain kinds of classification of images of galaxies can be done by the untrained eye, just by comparing them to a set of images, and this is something that they ask the members of the general public to do. And because people tend to be quite interested in astronomy and in distant galaxies, a lot of people do volunteer their time just to look at these photographs of star systems from thousands or millions of light years away, that we can contribute to something that we understand as being valuable science. And this is one of the most successful voluntary crowdsourcing projects we've ever seen. This has led to a range of other projects using the same Zooniverse technology that have used the same sort of methodology, and this has included a few projects that we would recognize in classics, such as the Ancient Lives project, which people use to transcribe Greek papyri just by looking at letter forms. So this is the vast majority of people who don't know a single bit of Greek, much less classical Greek paleography. And similarly, there's a project to transcribe and categorize texts from the Cairo Geniza. But all sorts of things across the natural sciences and various other kinds of sciences have used this methodology to get the public interested in doing effectively unskilled, very small tasks again and again and again on their projects. The idea of these projects is that these are microtasks. You're not asking the members of the public to really get involved in research activity per se. It tends to be fairly mechanical, so either straightforward transcription or identification of images against a limited back list of possibilities, and so it doesn't really require the expertise of a researcher. But on the other hand, it's not so mechanical and repetitive that a computer can just do it. That artificial intelligence could do so. Where there's something that a human needs to bring to it. Because we're talking about unskilled members of the public doing the work, these often involve fairly intricate vetting mechanisms. So, for example, having 2 or multiple people identifying the same object each time, so that moderators can compare any differences between them, and that can flag the ones that may be either more difficult or people were messing about or whatever other reasons. Or very often they have a set of moderation where an expert checks all the results before they become public. Problems with this method include the problems that have to be addressed when attempting to use this sort of crowdsourcing include issues of usability. How do you make your interface easy enough for unskilled members of the public to use? There is the issue of motivation. How do you persuade people to get involved in working on your project? And people have used things such as gamification. They've had leaderboards and high scores where people can get involved. There is but by long tail, I mean the fact that a lot of people will try it once and never try it again. How do you keep this sustained over the long term? So and then reliability, as I say, people are concerned about needing to vet these materials. What sorts of things can we ask the general unskilled public to contribute to that that won't cause us problems, that won't be that won't require more expertise than they have. The other kind of crowdsourcing that that I want to talk about is closer to the sort of thing that we're looking at and asking you to get involved with, and that is the inviting the public to contribute things that only they as individuals can contribute. So again, they may be small things, they may be microtasks, but they're small pieces of information that the public have. This is something that's been going on for a long time, very, very far pre-digital. Famously, the Oxford English Dictionary was inviting the public to submit individual words or individual definitions or individual citations by mail well over 100 years ago, and still do now. This is their submission form on the OED website. And these are where an individual member of the public may not be an expert lexicographer, but may just have information about one particular word that they can share with the dictionary. The most famous example of this is, of course, Wikipedia, or here the Latin Wikipedia, just for variety, where again, this is most contributors to this are not sufficiently expert to be encyclopedia authors and editors, but they know something about one particular topic. They may know a lot about mid-20th century baseball, and they can submit lots of information about that. So I think we know quite a lot about classics, and we can contribute bits to the articles on classics in Wikipedia, and arguably we should, because we're leaving misinformation out there if we don't correct it. Other projects of this kind collect images or letters or objects that people have. So there's been a lot of several projects in the last 5 years have collected information that people may have in their family collections or archives from the First World War. And you see this example from the Europeana collections, where they have a lot of information of letters and photographs and other items, and they invite the public to submit their own information if they have something letters from their grandparents or great grandparents lying around that they can contribute to this. So this is again something that only they can contribute because they have this. There's similar to what we're looking at. One of our colleagues, Zina Kamash, has been involved in this Postcard to Palmyra project that was inviting members of the public to contribute their impressions of various projects and resources. I won't go too much into that, but there's much more information about this in one of the publications on the reading list for this session, if you're interested. And an interesting example is the Heritage Gazetteer of Libya, which is this part of the project hasn't been established yet, but the aim of this project is not only to build a gazetteer where for each place in Libya, we have all of the historical names and classical names for this place that we know of recorded in the record, but to have a feature where contemporary users can contribute any information they know about what this place is called now or has been called at any point in the last century. This would include local residents of the place who say, well, yes, you say that's the Temple of Apollo, but we all call that. And, interested to know what, 1960s archaeologists called this particular building, because sometimes our records will say, some obscure building name, and we just don't know what that means. So collecting that sort of information, again, these are things that individuals know that no expert could possibly gather all of this information without all these contributions. So the idea of this second kind of crowdsourcing is much more the wiki idea, and as you know, one of the back formations of the word wiki is that it stands for what I know is. So each person contributes their unique knowledge or material to the whole. The motivation from this then is not financial nor to do with gamification, but it comes from that person's expertise and from their interest in the particular context to which they're contributing. The idea then remains that, or an important issue then, is that contributors should be credited with this for these contributions, because they are in a sense researchers alongside the people running the projects, and in some cases contributors may end up becoming co-investigators, becoming co-researchers on the project, because their contribution is so rich, and it turns out they have this expertise that could be useful both for the individual pieces of information and for the project organization as a whole. Again, there are various issues with this, things that you have to keep in mind if you're running this sort of project. One is the issue of confidentiality and the related issue of data protection. If people have contributed something, yes, we want to credit them, but there are also certain things about those people that we may have this information in digital form that we shouldn't share without their consent. There are issues, especially when we're talking about parts of the world which have recently been, war-torn. In one way or another, there are issues of other sensitivities that people may want to complete confidentiality. A lot of people contributing to information about cultural heritage from, Libya or Syria might just not want anyone ever to see their name in public on this for very understandable reasons. So these sorts of things have to be kept in mind. And related to this, there's the issue of trust. I mean, how much do we trust the information that we're receiving, and how much do we deserve the trust of the people who are offering their information? Are we going to protect their information? Are we going to use their information in ways that they would like, as opposed to potentially not? And then sustainability is again an issue. How do we keep these projects going in the long run? Where is this material going to live? This is particularly important when it's material that's been collected and contributed by many individuals, and therefore doesn't exist in its entirety anywhere else, unlike many other more conventional data sets. And then how do we keep up communication with and between the various users of these projects? So these are all sorts of issues. How would we go about running a project of this kind? And these are all issues that we're going to have to think about as we participate in this project this afternoon. The second thing then that I want to talk about are our vocabularies. Well, talk in terms of authority lists. So when we start annotating things in these notebooks, in these archives, and we want to say a little bit more about them and disambiguate them, what terms are we going to use to disambiguate, and how are we going to control these? Where are we going to get the vocabularies, or are we going to allow our users to create a completely free-form vocabulary as we go? So when we talk about vocabularies, we're talking about things such as, here's one example, the Eagle vocabulary of types of inscription, where this will say things like, funerary, honorific, decree, various different kinds of inscription that have been defined, so that each term can be translated into multiple languages, so that we can have a little bit more consistency in how we use these, but also in making sure we can understand these. And each item of vocabulary in a vocabulary such as this has a unique identifier, has a URI, which we can use when I use the word tombstone to point to their definition of funerary inscription, because that's what I mean, even though I'm using a different word for it. Other vocabularies that we've seen already include the Pleiades Gazetteer and many other gazetteers, where this is an authority list of places from the ancient world, and so this is another example of the same thing. Again, there's a URI for that place, which helps us to understand that when I say Alexandria, I mean this particular Alexandria on the Nile Delta, not one of the other 34 Alexandrias in the ancient world. The Getty Research Institute has produced several different vocabularies and authority lists of this kind. The Art and Architecture Thesaurus is one that might be of interest to us today. And they also have unique identifiers for individual terms. So if we want to be absolutely clear that we're talking about a balustrade or a particular type of architecture rather than something else, this is something where we could quite easily misuse a term, but having a thesaurus or an authority to point to is really useful for that. Or you can have your own internal authorities. So projects such as the Ancient Inscriptions in the Northern Black Sea have their own internal authority of persons, where there are a few hundred persons defined in their internal authority list, that then whenever a name occurs in one of these inscriptions, they can point it to this authority. There's no universal prosopography to which they can point externally that provides URIs, but they have this internal list instead. The concept of the controlled vocabulary is familiar to anyone who's ever used a database or filled in an online form, where some of the fields are not just free text. When they say, what language is this resource in, they don't want just to give you free text to enter any string you like. They want a controlled list of languages, so that when you say English, as in this image, you use exactly the term they use, and it can be pointed to what they understand by it. And then, every database will have effectively a series of different tables containing these controlled vocabularies for some of the forms, some of the fields in the main table. And you can see most of these most of these fields actually are drop-down menus. They are controlled vocabularies rather than free text. For free text entry can of course cause problems in as well. Controlled vocabularies of this kind can cause problems as well. The most famously, if you're filling in a form and it says, "What is your title? Is it Mr. or Mrs.?" So, well, some people would prefer to have other titles than those. It's a limitation. Databases very often will allow you to, if your chosen, your preferred string that you want to put in this particular field is not on the list already, you can then click on the last entry, which is add a new one. But most web forms don't give you that option. So that's again, as I say, a potential issue with these vocabularies. The other kind of vocabulary, as it were, that you can use to help disambiguate and tag objects is the completely free-form tag. So projects like the Flickr Commons and the Wikimedia Commons, they collect many millions of images, and they ask the public to tag these images, to tell us what is in these images. And so you can tag these images. You can say, well, this is an animal. This is a taking this image that's on the screen. This is a marine scene. It's a boat. It's, I don't know, is it a catamaran? Whatever. It has a sail on it, etc. You can say various things about the image to help other people then to search for it. So what's interesting with this is that every individual brings potentially a different sense of what is interesting in this image. I've said various things about the boat and the sea, but someone else might be interested in what kind of tree is in the background there, or what kind of cloud is in the sky. All sorts of very different things that you can find, which means that when you look at some of these tags, if you're coming from the other direction, once you imagine that several hundreds of thousands of images have been tagged in this way, we can look at those tags and say, well, what can I find when I look for catamaran? And you find all these various different things. That can lead you to sometimes surprising results because other people have tagged different things than you were expecting. So for this, the concept of the folksonomy is where, rather than using a taxonomy, which is a predefined hierarchy of controlled language and controlled vocabulary, you use this form where you allow each user to invent their own tags as you go along. This gives you a lot of flexibility. It's freeform. It has a lot of expressiveness involved because it's almost, it's how likely is it that we would have tagged, catamaran with an orange sail or whatever in a taxonomy before we unless you did this freeform. It can allow for unexpected or serendipitous content. You can find all sorts of things that you weren't expecting to find. We were using the Flickr Commons many years ago to try and find images of the ancient city of Aphrodisias, or not images of the ancient city, but images of the modern archaeological site of Aphrodisias. And one of the first images we found that had been tagged as Aphrodisias, in our collection, was a photo which was basically just a photo of a camel sitting on the ground. It was a very nice photo, but it happened to have been taken in Aphrodisias, so it was tagged with that. It turned out that wasn't useful, but you can potentially find useful things that you wouldn't have looked for if there wasn't this serendipitous feature. The main advantage of this is that you don't need any particular expertise in the vocabularies. You don't need to consult a thesaurus. You don't need to say, well, I know what I'm going to use. I know what this is, and I know where to find it in the Getty Art and Architecture thesaurus. You can just say, well, that looks like a balustrade to me, and just write the word straight in there. Drawbacks, of course, are that this then leads to massive inconsistency. It's exactly what we're trying to avoid with controlled vocabularies, is different people calling the same thing different things. So you have this massive inconsistency. In addition to inconsistency, you also have the possibility for error. People can mistype, or they can say that looks like a balustrade to me, and it's not. That could also happen with the controlled vocabulary, of course. It means that people may tag all sorts of things, but not tag the one thing you were really hoping they would. The one thing you really need them to tag is, whether the object is made of marble or limestone, and that's the one thing people don't tag because they're much more interested in the fact that there's a crow sitting on top of it. All sorts of things that could fail with this approach. It also means that in order to exploit these tags, you do need to either use some sort of normalization script, which says, okay, these 19 different words that people have used all mean balustrade, or you have to use some sort of natural language processing to try and turn these into some sort of real structured information. So anyway, that's the background. We want to think now about specifically about tagging the Wood archive. Jen, were we going to talk about specifically the pages, or would we talk a little bit about audiences first?
I've got some slides on the pages if you'd like.
I'm just trying to remember what order we were going to do it.
On the order, I think audiences and local perspectives is what we plan to talk about next.
Okay, great. Would you like to lead that?
If you like, sure. I don't have any slides to go with it.
No, me neither.
Great. Yeah. Sorry, where to start? Audiences is a difficult one. And I guess the first thing is about for me, the exciting thing is the possibilities of different audiences in the kind of open nature of this work, and kind of disrupting the authorities that we usually rely on in identifying archaeological material and what's important about it. So where value has been placed. Gabby, sorry, just because I have to mute it, I'll pass. What do you think?
Sure. Yeah. No. Sorry, I'm also controlling the the broadcast settings. Yeah, so I think the interesting question is what perspectives will different audiences bring to this sort of tagging, and to what degree do we respect different audiences? I think that's going to be the really important question. We've talked about the issue of if the general public are tagging something, do we have to vet it? Do we trust it slightly less? But if what we're interested in is actually those local perspectives, then actually I'm less interested in correcting where someone has said, you know, this arch that has always been, you know, in the ruins very close to my hometown, you know, made of marble, and we're all thinking it's not made of marble. You know, that I'm less interested in correcting that than I am in the fact that that was said in the first place. That's part of the data rather than an error in the data. And this is something that's often can be quite hard to communicate to scholars. I've spoken to people recently who've had, you know, very much had the idea that the input of any non-expert is untrustworthy and therefore not useful. You know, I was talking with someone who was specifically putting together a project of this kind to get local perspectives on a museum that was you know, outside of Europe, and their advisor was telling them, you know, you can't just get local perspectives. You have to vet those perspectives if you're crowdsourcing. You can't crowdsource anything without vetting it first. And I was like, well, who's going to vet the local perspectives? You know, some you know, English archaeologist who says no, they're wrong, don't include it, because that's not the data you're trying to get.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I find interesting about that is that it's not just about fact-finding and truthfulness. Part of that issue of trust is around a really paternalistic attitude about who is allowed to communicate with and about this material, which sometimes is very colonial in nature, but is definitely value-laden. Either way you slice it, it's not just about kind of scientific authority and, yeah, truth, I think. Oops, yeah.
And so the other question, I guess, that we ask is, what sorts of things are we expecting to hear from these audiences, or should we not be asking that question? Should we just wait and see what they say? I mean, that's a little bit hard because, you know, people will say, as we know from the seminar experiment we did last year, people say, well, what do you want us to tag? So we have to give them some examples and then say, or anything else, and then hopefully they do find things that weren't what we suggested. But
yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges there is not just about kind of expectations and examples, but about kind of tacit knowledge in how you approach a text at all or an image at all to start tagging. So not just from the perspective of the technology, but in terms of what you're looking at and how to interact with that. And I'm not quite sure how we overcome that, but that's part of the experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I don't think I was going to add anything to that. I was just going to paraphrase it. Does anyone else in the call have anything they want to add at this point? What sorts of things we might get from different audiences? What we might expect if we have students tagging an 18th century archive, what we might expect if we had a non-classically trained Syrian expatriate tagging something, if we had someone who had, you know, pre the current war been on holiday to Palmyra and so had their own experiences of it from there. Or maybe those are just open questions we can be thinking about while we're looking at the rest of the material.
Okay, should I give a bit of an intro to the documents?
Yes, please.
Okay. Oh no, it's.
Oh, we've just had a suggestion from Ellie in the comments. Can you see that, Jen?
Nope.
She said. they might mention things that were there but are not anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important, isn't it? Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Sorry. Can you see that, Gabby?
Yeah.
Great. So just briefly, so the wood collection that was donated in the 1920s is 28 items in total, one of which is missing. The main part of the collection is diaries and sketches from the tour of the Levant in 1750-51, made by Wood and his 3 companions. The ICS is in the process of digitizing the whole collection, but it's made up of, it's really diverse in its makeup. So we're looking at 2 particular items today, selections from 2 items, and that's volume 17 and volume 18A. So one of them is the scanned pages of Bora's sketchbooks that include his sketches of Palmyra, and the other is 18A, which is an extract from something that Wood's daughter wrote based on Wood's manuscripts. So we don't have the original manuscripts. They haven't come down to the present archive, but these are basically extracts from or she says, not basically, they are extracts from my father's manuscripts, is what he said. So the text that we've chosen for today is something called The Journey to Palmyra, is the title that it's given. It's a selection from a longer volume in which Wood's daughter, Elizabeth, has copied extracts from her father's manuscript, which don't survive, or at least aren't known to survive. So they're not in any publicly indexed archive. And so because we don't have the thing that it's based on, we can't be precisely sure how it relates to, say, Wood's field notes, which we do have for other sites. It seems to be pretty close because it relates quite clearly to the published version of one of the things that makes these worth studying in and of themselves, and why we started here, is because they are not the same texts. So the Elizabeth's manuscripts extracts have details, for instance, that are not in the published account. So there's the possibilities of doing something new with it. We've also chosen it because it's a discrete text. So it's short enough and bounded enough that it makes sense as a few pages, and something we can link to other parts of the archive. One of those other parts is this sketchbook of Bora's. So this is just one page of his sketch of the little temple of Balshamim. You can see that one of the challenges, and this is just kind of like obviously a snapshot, but you can see just how sketchy and light the pencil drawing is. And one of the challenges is that for digitization, we have to adjust the contrast to make it more legible on the screen. But the materiality of these things is really quite ephemeral. And it's balancing that kind of, or one of the things I find interesting about this whole project is balancing the kind of the realities of the materiality of the objects with the demands of interacting with it digitally. It's also interesting in terms of that ephemerality because of the huge leap between these sketched field drawings and in the archive, and the very much larger and more detailed and more authoritative engraving in the published version. And so this raises a question about digitization, but also how we take into account things like scale. One of the reasons I'm quite interested in these sketchbooks is because everyone presumes, so scholars that have worked on the engravings presume that there's something in between. So there's some intermediary documents between the sketches that Bora made and the final engravings, because the level of detail is so much higher. But the reality is we don't have any other material. Like, no one has located anything. No one has seen any intermediate material. There's definitely measurements. So, but there's no other drawings. So one of those questions is, can we use the archives to untangle how much people saw in the field and how much they're kind of translating their impressions and ideas and imaginative reconstructions of the site into the way it was visualized. Here's another view that we have both in the sketchbook and in the published work. They're the same view, but it's very different forms. So we can see in these comparisons some of the kind of great leaps of archaeological impressions, and the way also that these publications create certainty. So they look, these engravings look very authoritative and clear, I guess. They look like someone has measured each of these blocks, and that all of it is much more securely known than we would think by looking at the same thing in the pencil sketch, which is much more impressionistic in many ways. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, great.
Okay.
So I will then start looking at Recogito itself. There is a link in the session page for this session to the entry for this in Recogito that that you can use, and it should be available for anybody who has that link to edit. So if you have a Recogito account, if you click on that link in the session page, it should take you to this page, and you should be able to create annotations. I'll very quickly just give you a demo on how to create an annotation, because although Valeria gave you a demo of Recogito last week, she quite deliberately only showed you how to use this to annotate text rather than image. So the methods are slightly different. So you have this this field. Firstly, we have this collection that we've uploaded is about 17 pages, which are listed down here on the left. So you can see some of the prints from the published volume down here, some pages from the Borrow notebooks, and then some pages from the Wood, the transcription of the Wood notebooks there. And there are a few annotations in there already, because as I say, we did an experiment with this last year, but we would like to continue this experiment today. And on the right-hand side in the middle here, you have the main image of the page we're currently looking at. So we're currently looking at the first one here, page 89. And you can zoom in and out of this the usual way, either using your mouse wheel or using these buttons over here to zoom in and out. You can drag to move around to look at it more closely. One thing that you probably will want to do is click on this button here to hide some of this extraneous material around the page. Once you've found the page you want, you don't need the summary at the top, and you don't need the thumbnails down the left. So we've got a slightly more of a closer zoom on the document. So we can, and I haven't planned exactly what I'm going to annotate here, so I'm having to read his handwriting as we do so, as I do so. But you can see some of the things that have been annotated in here already. So unlike with text, where you can just double click on a word or highlight the characters of a word, and it will highlight those texts and transcribe them. With an image, there's no text that the computer is aware of here, so we have to transcribe the text as well. So when I want to transcribe, I'm going to create the annotation using something called a tilted box. This is the most simple and effective way. So I'm going to just tag the title of this here. Well, the word Palmyra has already been tagged, but I'm going to tag the whole title here, which is Approach to Palmyra, because that has a slightly different meaning. So to tag this text, oops, I'll zoom out a bit. I will want to draw a box around it. So to draw a box, I click once where I want to start the box. I just move then the cursor along to where the baseline of that box will end. So I've clicked once and released. I then just move the cursor across, and I can move all over the place, but I move it to where I want to be. Then I click again, and that creates then a box. And again, having released the cursor, I move the cursor up to where the top of the box is, click a third time, that creates the box, creates the annotation, and I can then transcribe. And so I can say that says Approach to Palmyra, It's neither a person nor a place nor an event, so I'm just going to add a comment saying title of section, and at this point I can also add a tag. Now, adding the tag, the comment is free text, and that you can put as much information in there as well. You can write it in complete sentences. Or not. For the tag, this is where we want you to use some kind of vocabulary. So you could either use a controlled vocabulary for whatever kind of thing it is you're annotating. If you're annotating places, there's the word Palmyra there. I very much hope someone has annotated as a place and given it the Pallades URI, or maybe a geonames URI rather, because this is the modern location that we're talking about, not the ancient location that they actually approached. But for a string-like approach to Palmyra, that's not quite the sort of thing. I can't think of any external vocabularies that I could use for this, or maybe I just don't know about them. So instead, I'm just going to invent my own tag for this. So what is this? I'm going to say it's a title. I'm also going to say it's a description of movement, let's say, or direction. Various different tags I could just make up. I'm making these up as I go along. I might use different ones if I tag the same thing a different day. Different people would almost certainly use different ones, but that's the point of folksonomy. Because we're using folksonomy rather than a controlled vocabulary, to get the full expressiveness, it's best to come up with as many different tags as you can for the same thing, to increase the possibility that someone will find what they're looking for. So it's arguable whether I'm right about any of these, but again, I'm just a member of the public, not an expert on Wood or on Palmyra, so I can put in whatever I like. I then click OK. That annotation is there. You can still see that the other annotation's in there as well. Wait a minute, I didn't want to do that. I can click on that annotation and see it. I can add further tags to it. I can add a reply to the original comment. I suppose I can also edit the original comment. And because it was my comment, I guess I can delete it. I'm not sure whether you can delete other people's comments, but anyway, I could do all sorts of things that I want to change to that. I could also edit my transcription up there by the look of it. So there, I just wanted to show the methodology of how you would create these tags. If what you're tagging is not a page of transcribed text like this, but an image of something, you might tag it in a different way. So here, if we go on to the one of the pages from Laura's notebook, we have various things in this image. I'm going to naively assume that this is the arch in the middle here. It's an arch anyway. So I'm again going to do a tilted box, and I'm going to say, here's the baseline of what I'm tagging. That goes up to the top. Maybe it includes that part. And I'm going to, that's slightly awkward as it's, we need to zoom out a bit because the bit I was going to type in went off the architectural. Great, I'll reuse that. That sounds good. I'm not sure what else to say there. I'm going to use the word perspective because I'm interested in articulating artistic methods as well. Whatever, I can use any kind of tags. And again, it's created just a tag on a subsection of that image. So again, I don't necessarily want to prejudge what people are going to tag or to influence what we want you to tag. We want you to tag whatever you find interesting in here. One thing that you might do when you first start looking at this and look at what things people have tagged already. There's someone that appears to have tagged the capital. Someone over here has tagged this as Corinthian order and mentioned that the detail is clear in the published illustration. Etc. Various things that they've tagged in this image. If we look at some of the other images, people have tagged all sorts of other things in there as well. Something that that if I can find it, not sure I can. Is it this one? No. Okay, never mind about that. So some of these we see the same thing in, or a similar view in the printed volume to the sketches, and then again you might compare them. You might tag both and say, you know, compare that to the thing in the other thing. So that's, I think, as much as I want to say about Recogito here. What I would like now to ask is what you all would tag in this. So again, for the other people in the chat, what would you look for and try and tag in these pages? Do you think? Well, start off with, would you like us to look at a page of text or at an image first?
I think images might be easier for if we are sort of trying to imitate some sort of crowdsourcing, right. Since the text might be even. I mean, one thing that came to my mind is that the handwriting might be difficult to read for some people.
Yes, it certainly will. I mean, it's difficult to read, I think, anyway. But if you're additionally reading it and your native language is in English, it'll be that little bit more difficult. But then it's not going to be more difficult than papyrological handwriting, surely. There's handwriting on this image as well.
Ah.
I'm not sure I want to try and read that. So anything in this image that anyone would like to look more closely at? Consider annotating. What's this? Any idea what that is?
That's the detail of the base of a column or a capital upside down.
Right. Probably. Shall I tag it as that?
I think it's a relatively distinctive motif. It might be recognizable in other images.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I would tag that particular motif with the little rosette in the...
So this, oops, just a tilted box. Okay. So just this,
right, yeah.
This part here, in particular.
Yeah.
Okay, and how would we tag that? There's no transcription. Is there any way for me to get that to now come down on the screen? I'm not sure. Yes, there we go. So we can say, what did you say it was? It was a very distinctive motif. Do we think this is a pedestal or a capital? Did we decide?
I couldn't I couldn't say. The orientation would say pedestal, but it looks more like a capital to me. I don't know.
And then tags. How would you tag that motif then? So it's floral.
Yeah. Or architectural again.
Architectural motif. I'm not sure how I'd describe those looping curves. I'm sure there is an art historical way to describe that.
I'm sure there is. I'm not aware.
Let's say swatches. Okay, so we've yeah, that's one thing that you might tag in there. Great. Should we try a different image? Let's try one of the modern images. They're slightly clearer to see what's going on. Something like this. This was a very there was a lot going on in this one.
So one of the things that I was interested in annotating when we did this experiment, although I didn't really got much time to do it, was trying to identify those elements that were quite likely to have been added, that were not actually there, like all this rubble, all these broken columns. Yeah. I don't think they were there. So to sort of flag somehow the elements in the published version that, I mean, I have no means to say for sure they're not there, but I think they are likely to be added.
Or even if they were there, they were probably not drawn, and so this is just an imaginative reconstruction of them. Yeah.
Sure also the little figures, the staffage, you know, the little people in them that are kind of definitely added as kind of pictorial scales.
Right. Are there any people in this one?
Yeah, they do sometimes lurk in the ruins, but maybe not in this one precisely.
Yeah. Well, we can pull up another one. I'm now looking at all the corners to see if there's any people hiding in there.
Sorry, there's probably no one on those ones.
It's kind of an Assassin's Creed flashback.
But Valeria's right. There's like this weird pictorial convention of rubble and ruin that is not necessarily linked to any form of actual object or measurement.
Right. I think this here is an inscription, isn't it? There's text on there.
Yeah.
Just probably gibberish. Yeah.
It's probably what, sorry?
I think it's probably gibberish. Again, it's just for, you know, for aesthetic purposes.
Yeah.
Nice spot though, yeah.
Is it possible to rotate the picture there while you are?
Yes. Let me finish that annotation then, yes. So I think it's, if I can remember, rotate the image. I now have to go to move, and then Alt and drag the mouse to rotate it. And then I may of course have rotated it the wrong way. Is this as close as it'll let me zoom in? Is it? Yeah, I may have put it in. I mean, we may be looking at it upside down now.
Yeah, it looks so.
Let me zoom in further this time. No, not for long. I was trying to decide whether that was going to be Greek or Aramaic script, but I'm not sure I can even tell which of those it is. Anyone want to guess?
Well, I would guess Greek, but don't ask me any letters.
Yeah, I would go with Valeria and say it's not even text, it's like the impression of text.
Yes. But if it were text, we could transcribe it. Anything else anyone want to look at in this image you'd like us to zoom in on?
One of the things that's neat is the lettering that relates to the text. So I think if you zoom in, you can see like above some of the hills and in some of the features, there's like a key. Yeah. Because presumably, could you link that somehow to the text if you'd transcribed the text?
Valeria?
You can create connections between 2 points in the same image, but you cannot link elements that are into different images, let's say. But you could maybe copy the transcription of, you know, what the key is referring to in the comments, for example. Or you could create, I don't know, an hyperlink to somewhere where the text is online, with an anchor or something, and you just put the URL in the comments as well.
Or even just a human language description of where to find that. This is the stuff on, on page 22.
Yeah.
It describes
citation. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So one of the questions then that comes out of this, and this is sort of the final question we wanted to discuss in this group, and what we'll talk about with our students again next week. Some of us is that now, having looked at these things and annotated a couple of things, which of these features in here do you expect different audiences to annotate? Is there a potential audience who, looking at this image, what they would actually see is, oh, look over here, I know what that hill is. I know that hill, I recognize it. Is there an audience who would annotate something completely different from what we were looking at? And how valuable is that? Or potentially would tag that hill in the background and say, as we said for that inscription, that hill's not actually there. That's equally possible.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting is that the possibilities for those kind of multivocal accounts to be both present in the same package or place in the way that the annotation is allowing.
So yeah, to take Ali's suggestion earlier, we could very well imagine an audience who would look at this photograph, at this drawing, and say, this feature here was no longer there in the 1980s. This feature here was, but is no longer there now, and so forth. And could look at individual features in there and give us much more sort of on afterlife sort of commentary on them.
I was already very impressed with the variety of interest that our experiment at the ICS already showed. We had for example, experts in architecture getting really interested in the numbers that are near the columns, the different components of the columns and the various measurements, and they double check them, and they even found mistakes. For me, they were just a bunch of numbers, right. And someone else, I think it was it was Yari that annotated, not the printed, but the handwriting, the notebooks, actually the numbers in the notebooks, and someone else that was an expert on the material component. They annotated features on the paper, like this line. In the paper, means that the page has been folded, or things like that. Things that I would have, for me, there were noise over this line doesn't make me see the image clearly, but for them, they were relevant, they were information. So even just those few minutes that we let the people in the ICS that were already, quite a selected group of users were able to come up with, I think, was quite exciting for me personally.
Yeah, this was the annotated column you were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. With those dimensions written in there, and some of those couldn't have been right.
Yeah. Gary is very precise.
Well, I guess as an architect you have to be, as a scholar of architecture you have to be, So there's all sorts of annotations in here already, but there's all sorts of further annotations that could be added. And as I say, we had people annotate things that we completely didn't expect. We had someone go through the narrative and annotate every mention of herbs and spices. We had someone go through and annotate every bit of evidence for the process of digitization that they could find, including a picture of Joanna Ash's thumb that had crept around the page onto the scanner.
Yeah, that was me. Because it's interesting about the process of doing it as well. I mean, I think one of the audiences that it'd be fun to do this with is actually people who know 18th and 19th century architecture, because to look at where these motifs are recognizable from that stuff. Because Bora is building stuff in London and all over the UK, and so these motifs don't just enter the kind of archaeological knowledge base; they enter kind of the architectural. There's the books, and in St. James and in the V&A, you could find these things there. And I mean, I don't know the lineage of that, but it'd be interesting to hear.
I definitely spotted a building in Turin that is decorated with almost the exact copy of one of the sketches in this notebook. I can dig up the name.
Yeah, but it'd be interesting to link that as well.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about archaeology, you know, it's about all of these other frames of reference that you can bring in.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's Castello Racconigi in Torino that is the ceiling of one of the salon. It's decorated with Palmyrene motifs.
Cool. So yeah, we could transcribe the text. That doesn't look like English, but I'm not sure it is.
No, it's Italian. Soffitto. I can only work out the first letter, the first word.
Anno de Buglioni. I don't know.
The last one looks like a name, but
yeah.
Maybe he was thinking already of the possible application, so it was the ceiling of some palace that he had in mind.
Right. Fantastic.
Yeah, it could be. We do know for sure that he was deliberately collecting them for that purpose. Like, it wasn't an afterthought at all. It was part of the project.
He was making a catalog.
Yeah.
You can see it really clearly in the busts that are in some of the ceilings, which don't look Palmyrene at all. They're like, you know, 18th century ladies. It's really interesting.
Right. So this again is expertise that a different person could bring to this. I mean, even just among us, if there are any native Italian speakers among the people taking part in this exercise, transcribing some of the Italian that you can have a much better guess at than I would be something we could throw in. Anyone who's architecturally or mathematically inclined might look at these numbers and figure out what's going on. This looks like music, but it's so complex.
I find this is very fascinating in a way that you can get almost anything, very unexpected things, but then people who are actually doing the annotations, they might have some sort of, they can feel prohibited quite easily, sort of, what can I in fact annotate there? What is the thing? If I can recognize that this is a temple, but I can't say anything more about that, then I probably shouldn't do anything. And that's sort of, there is this barrier that the person who is doing something needs to overcome. So
yeah,
sometimes it might be then good to always have something there beforehand, sort of showing a model or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, the thing is, or anything else needs to be said.
But then, and just this conversation, I mean, someone looking at it now might say, well, I'm going to tag this floral motif, as a floral motif so that, it can be found alongside the floral motif we tagged earlier.
Yeah. But people would want to have a motif for doing something so that this would be useful for somebody then. That's part of the question, isn't it? I mean, is are we going to find this useful? I mean, is someone actually going to go through after the entire 3,000 pages, I haven't mentioned, is of the wood materials have been digitized and annotated?
As someone going to go through and use this folksonomic tagging to pull out floral motifs across the whole volume. That probably wouldn't be the most efficient way to pull out those floral motifs, but other things that we're not the experts in, or we hadn't planned to tag, they might be. And we're not necessarily specifically interested in floral motifs, but we may discover an interest in floral motifs when we realise that that's one of the things that is really indicative of borrowers' designs elsewhere in the world, that we then have to start looking at. So anything could be useful. We just don't know yet. So tag everything. Yes, tag that building in the background and say this is a temple. That's all I know, right? It's what I know is you tag what you know. Someone else can add to it.
Yeah, or tag questions, right? So couldn't we use it that way? Could people pose questions or even develop research questions just by on a scale from what the hell is this to, what is the connection between this floral motif and other floral motifs or 18th century architecture? I don't know.
Yeah. No, that would be very interesting, wouldn't it? And then that then adds to the motivation to look at other people's annotations. Because I'm assuming that the person who tagged this up here knew exactly what it was and tagged it. Well, it's tagged more, so they probably did. Yes, they tagged it as a place, geonames. But it could just as easily have been that they tagged it as a question, saying, what is this? There's a very strange shaped letter at the end that's neither quite an R nor quite an N. Can anyone else transcribe this?
Could you use it for teaching? So the students log on and put questions and then tag them as questions so that you could search for all the questions related to the document and then try to answer them? I don't know.
Sure.
Is that
yeah, that's a perfectly legit way to use the tags. And specifically for teaching, I know that there are some features that are under development that allow members of a group, for example, a class, to communicate between them and with the instructor. So there will be, let's say, a more tailored version of Recogito that is very much specific for teaching, and where maybe, even also asking questions would be easier. But no, definitely using tags, why not?
Yeah, I like the accessibility of this for teaching in a way that it's not kind of appropriate to be pulling out Bora's very fragile notebooks for lots of teaching sessions, but this is a way that you could really pay close attention to the documents in a really detailed way, and be quite interactive with them without having to actually interact with them.
And again, you'd have to plan that in advance as part of the exercise, because the notebooks or whatever might have occasional questions in them that someone could have tagged as a question, and so you'd want to make sure that the tag question was only being used for a student's question, not for.
Yeah, or make a specific tag that's question in a course name or something.
Yeah. Or you could sub-filter them by date, I guess. So any questions posted in this week were.
Oh, can you do that? Okay, great.
Presumably.
One thing that also occurred to me in a way that you were also mentioning about maybe people who have visited the place as a tourist or something like that, they can add something. Then would it be also somehow possible to, there was this view of the colonnaded street, then if people have their own photographs of that same place and they would somehow link it to this, would that sort of things be useful or something like that? And possible to do? Maybe you would have to have the photo in Flickr and have the URL.
Yeah, I don't think we could upload the photo for them, but if they had the photo already online somewhere, particularly, especially if it were in some standard repository. Yeah.
But it does create those connections, doesn't it? The ability to easily flick from Bora's drawings to the engravings to a modern photograph of the same view, just that creates a lot of possibilities for kind of questioning it and, I don't know, just coming up with new ways of framing it.
Yeah.
And especially now, when you know, the Palmyra will be, it's on the terrible state of change at the moment. So if we have photographs of things that were, you know, present there earlier, but perhaps are no longer there, that might be good.
Yeah, that would potentially be a related sort of project to this, and this would be a way in which this could contribute to that project. Yeah. Yeah. I've stopped screen sharing because I think we're talking about more general issues now. We're also fairly close to running out of time, so but not to cut off discussion there.
You know what I'm like. I could talk about these notebooks forever. So feel free to cut off whenever you feel you need to.
Yeah, they could also potentially be a way to for people to attach, you know, their memories, their impressions to particular details or particular words, even, you know, in the manuscript. So it could become something closer to, you know, a narrative exercise, or you know, a preservation of memory, you know, kind of approach. I think that would be quite interesting too.
Yeah, I don't know quite how to. There's definitely also a link to the kind of work that Zina Kamash is doing that Gabby showed,
yes,
and that capturing of other memories and linking it to places. That is quite interesting. I'm not quite sure of like what the most effective technological way of doing that is, but yeah. Like maybe the thing in common is not like necessarily the text on Recogito, but the place tag, like the geolocator.
Yeah, I think this is quite close to, as Gabby mentioned in his talk, what the Heritage Gazetteer of Libya was aiming to do in a way. So giving, as you said, you know, unique identifiers, tags to places, to specific places, would have enabled people to share material that they had about that place, so a picture or things like that, tagging it with the code of that specific place, but also saying things about that place. So it was supposed to be a facilitator to gather local information about the heritage of Libya. Unfortunately, it's not there yet. I hope it will go there. But I thought that, you know, the idea of creating some sort of digital infrastructure to enable that was cool.
Part of the difficulty, of course, is that with all of these sites, both Libya and Syria and many other places, it's precisely the people who we want to talk to who we can't currently access. You know, the people who live right there. You know, we want to go there and visit and hold workshops there, and, you know, make sure that they own all this. But at the very least, we need to make sure that it's accessible to them in various ways.
Gabby, does Recogito work on a smartphone?
It works on tablet.
Okay,
I'm not sure if that's a smartphone, but I can check that.
Well, just because that seems to be like the most frequent way that people are definitely on, you know, using their smartphones on sites all the time for all kinds of things. So I don't know if there's some sort of tie-in, but it's like tablets would be good too. But just that's the immediacy of the place is another way of reaching those audiences, I think. I'm not quite sure of the mechanism, but
yes, definitely. And certainly anything that would come out of this in terms of communication, in terms of publication, you know, that should all be you know, accessible, and whatever bells and whistles we attach to it, search and filter features and geographical visualizations, we should make sure that's all totally you know, mobile accessible, and also in Arabic.
to start with, yeah.
Cool. Well, we're getting a little bit off the topic of annotation, but I think we've had lots and lots of useful things there, and we've definitely overrun our time, so we should probably let people go. But thanks very much, everybody. That's been great. I hope I haven't ignored too many comments, because I completely forgot to look for comments in the margins as we were talking. But yeah, thanks very much, everybody, and thanks in particular, Jen, for the presentation.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for letting me ramble on.
Pleasure. Great. And see you all next week, where we introduce tree banking. Mario will be back along with Polina Urdanova, and we'll introduce more for syntactic annotation of Greek and Latin text. Great. Cheers. See you all next week.
Thank you. Bye.